Welcome everyone. We can get started in this second session of the Political Economy Day of the CSAE conference. So welcome back to those of you who could join us in the first session, and welcome to those who just starting now. So we have a very exciting set of 4 papers around issues of elections and community participation. Just to set some slight ground rules, we're going to start now. Each presenter is going to gets 15 minutes to present. I'll give them a 2-minute warning to make sure we don't run out of time too much. And then we'll have kind of the overall Q&A at the end for 20-25 minutes. So why don't waste any time and get started with Manuel, present this paper.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see the presentation full screen. So thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present this, and thank you for participants for being interested in our project. I'm going to present here results from a project that was carried out in Kampala, Uganda for about almost 2.5 years now, and it's still going to continue for a little bit longer, together with a wonderful team of collaborators and co-authors, Ana Garcia Hernandez from Rosario and IPA, and McCartan Humphreys from Colombia and VCB. As a quick overview of the project, in early 2019, we were asked to assist an institution in Kampala, which is the city hall, to structure a data collection process for its citizens that would help feed the design of a new citizen charter that the city was planning. And this gave us the opportunity back then to actually carefully trace the process of creation of essentially a new institution at the local level. And I'll go a little bit more into the advantages of this setup, but just as a very broad overview, this data collection process involved about 2,300 citizens randomly selected from around the city, and then 2/3 of these citizens being randomized to a set of 188 small-scale citizen meetings organized throughout the city. And what I'm going to present here out of the many rounds of measurement that we've done throughout the project are results from our baseline survey, combined with results from the observations we undertook during these consultation meetings with citizens, as well as from a short post-consultation survey after the citizen meetings themselves. The main reason why we were very excited to take part in this project and to try to study this phenomenon in Kampala is that it gives us the wonderful opportunity to try to really understand how political inequality manifests itself from the beginning of a project, from the beginning of the political process all the way to the end. Now, without a doubt, there are countless studies done of inequalities in political inputs, such as participation. And there's definitely studies that are studying inequalities in responsiveness or inequalities in outputs. But one of the challenges with separating these different stages and studying them in a sort of an insulated framework is that we don't understand very well the interconnections between these 3 different stages. If we were to think of someone's welfare, for example, as a very short example here, someone's welfare expressed as a function of their baseline welfare, but also the amount of effort they expend towards a particular goal, multiplied by the probability that effort would result in them achieving their goal. You could see directly how output, which is the welfare in this case, might actually be influenced by a complex function of inputs, and we could call them throughput or responsiveness. That is the pi, the little pi symbol there in the equation. So it's not immediately clear when you scale this up to a political process where citizens interact with each other, that output inequality would automatically result from, say, input inequality or from throughput inequality. In fact, it could be that citizens spending more effort to achieve a political goal might actually mean that other citizens don't need to spend so much effort to reach the same goal that they desire. So this sort of micro process of setting up a citizen charter gave us the opportunity to observe all these different stages. As a secondary goal, of course, this also gave us the opportunity to speak more about participatory processes that are used in development to a great extent, and to understand what kinds of inequalities are manifested in these kinds of settings. So just as a short preview of findings before I go into design and in the actual process itself, we find that actually when consultations are implemented properly and there is great care in trying to mobilize participants, inequalities in participation to these kinds of processes can be reduced, but only up to a certain point. Inside the processes themselves, the same patterns of inequality as in traditional participatory acts are visible. We find evidence of limited elite capture, but we don't actually find evidence of outright disparities in responsiveness. And thankfully, we don't really find evidence of output inequalities, which does suggest the possibility that these three different stages are not sort of automatically linked to each other, but there actually could be a very complex dynamic at play. So I'll briefly describe the process and the research project, and then quickly move on to the results. Essentially, as part of our data collection process, we undertook a baseline survey of about 2,300 citizens in the summer of 2019. And out of these, 2/3 were randomly allocated to participate in a citizen consultation meeting. The remaining citizens were allocated to a pure control arm. Of these 2/3 of the baseline sample, about half were allocated to meetings that were facilitated or led by a bureaucrat from the institution that wanted to create the citizen charter, and the others were allocated to what we call a neutral facilitator, someone who had no contact with the institution. And as I mentioned earlier, we carefully measured opinions in the baseline survey. We measured dynamics during the meetings themselves, as well as opinions again after the meetings themselves. Just to give you a quick idea of what these meetings involve, these are not large-scale deliberative processes where participants discuss for multiple hours a single topic. Rather, these are smaller-scale consultation meetings of about an hour or an hour and a half, where about 6 to 8 participants recruited very locally from within one village in Kampala meet to discuss about 5 different topics related to how to design the charter. These meetings could be, as I said, facilitated either by local bureaucrats or neutral facilitators. And the objective was to collect input from citizens for the construction of this charter. At the end of the meeting, the group was asked to make a unanimous decision regarding these 5 separate topics for how to design the charter, and that decision was recorded by the facilitator. Now, it's important to mention that we selected the topics of discussion from among a bigger list of topics, so as to probe deeper into specific topics where disagreement is evident, either between citizens or between citizens and the institution itself, as these are really the more valuable topics for us to understand where the disagreement comes from and how to solve it. And as I mentioned, we surveyed preferences before the charter for citizens. We measured how they behaved during the consultations, and then measured their preferences after the citizen as well. And we did so for facilitators as well. And now here are the big results, and I'm going to try to structure them based on the 3 different types of inequalities that we see in input, in throughput, and in outputs. So when we look at conventional political participation in Kampala, we see the same kind of trends that we see quite frequently across many different polities in terms of inequalities. We see inequality in participation based on gender, on education, on wealth, and on linguistic ability, And we see them when we separate out different acts such as voting or participating in community affairs or contacting politicians, but we see them when we also group these different activities in a count of participation, like we do here. Now, as part of this process, we tried quite hard to mobilize participants to join the meetings and sent them frequent reminders, and as well as gave them a small incentive to attend the meeting. And when we look at whether the same dynamics are observed in the actual act of participating in the meeting, we no longer see this. There is full equality in terms of attending the meeting or not. However, when we go inside the meeting and measure the number of times that people have spoken without being invited by the facilitator, the same dynamics as we see in more typical types of participation reemerge. It's typically men, and it's typically wealthier and more educated and Luganda speakers that are actually more active during these meetings. Now, only 2 of these factors are statistically significant in this difference, but the dynamics are the same across all of these different factors. When we look at the total time spoken, exactly the same dynamic emerges again, most visible, of course, for gender here and for education. Now, we would say, summing up this evidence, we would say that there is clearly input inequality present, and that this is clearly matched by differences in pre-meeting preferences. So it is consequential, the fact that these different groups participate at different rates. When we move on from input to throughput, we notice, for example, here, a clear influence of facilitators in the outcome. We ask participants to decide, to answer the question of whether the institution is going in the right direction or not. And we see here plotted the share of agreement within a facilitator to that question, broken down by whether it's a facilitator from the institution or a neutral one. And you visibly see that in the case of a facilitator from the institution, they are far more likely to find unanimous agreement in the meetings that they chair compared to a neutral facilitator. If we were to look at all these different topics for the meeting, we actually find in the case of 5 out of 6 a clear influence of facilitators, and somewhere between 10% and 35% of the variance in the outcomes of the meeting is explained by who the facilitator is, which we interpret as a measure of influence of the facilitator over the process. Now, when we break this apart based on whether it's a neutral facilitator or a facilitator coming from the institution, we see similar patterns, though in this case they are a bit more muted. However, for how the institution should keep in contact with citizens, which we call here channels of communication, for raising fees and taxes, and for whether the institution is going in the right direction or not, we see that that frequently when there is a facilitator from this institution, the outcome is more likely to be the outcome that the institution favors compared to citizens. Thankfully, we find quite limited inequality in responsiveness. So we don't see there is a better match between pre-meeting preferences and meeting outcomes for specific subgroups in the population. There is, of course, a statistically significant effect of education for one of the topics, but throughout most of the topics, we don't see it. So in a sense, we do find some limited evidence of throughput inequality, but no evidence that there is responsiveness inequality and that some preferences of subgroups are favored. Moving very quickly to output inequality, and this is sort of the shorter sections, we do find some evidence that some groups are benefiting in terms of their the match between their pre-meeting preferences and the outcomes, depending on whether they participate or not. But at no point do we see a consistent difference in one direction, as we would expect to see. Sometimes participating in the meeting means you're more likely to get your outcome that you prefer. Sometimes it means you're less likely to get the outcome that you prefer. And we see this across wealth, across education, across gender.
Manuel,
Yes.
this is your 2-minute warning.
Thank you very much. I was actually almost over. So overall, we don't find evidence at the end of output inequality for any of the 5 discussion topics. There are some effects of these sociodemographics, but they're of inconsistent direction. And I come to my conclusions. I think the value of studying a process from beginning to end, even though we trade off the scale of a national election for observing a very local process, is that it allows us very fine control over measurement, over randomization, and over studying the linkages between these different patterns of inequality that we see here. So we do see input inequality during the consultations, but not in attendance at consultations, which we interpret as a result of our efforts to mobilize the population. We do find some influence of facilitators over the outcome of consultation, which should be of concern for the countless processes that are based on similar types of consultations, but we find no systematic evidence of output inequality. And we think that in future work, based on more rounds of measurement, but possibly other projects as well, there is definitely scope to look at whether participants' evaluations, for example, of the quality of the meetings have an influence on whether they want to engage in the future with the institution themselves, so as to speak about these dynamics of disengagement from politics and potentially re-engagement with a political institution. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Great. Thanks a lot, Manuel. That was very clear and concise. Now we're moving on to Wayne.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm thrilled to be in this session and have really enjoyed the papers so far. So thanks to all of you. My paper is called "Do Voters Reward Service Delivery?" And I'm going to bring experimental evidence from Liberia. So to just jump in and motivate this. One of the motivations for this paper is that public service reform can be seen as both a political asset and a liability. There's a question of whether better public service delivery can win votes for the politicians who promote it. A big body of evidence and maybe a lot of intuition about how democracy should work all suggest the answer should be yes. If you make government work better, if you give citizens better services, then you should be able to be held accountable for that in a positive way and be more likely to win re-election. But despite all the theoretical support for this, it's actually a bit tricky to measure empirically whether different kinds of public service improvements actually do help politicians get reelected. Partly that's because exogenous shocks to public service delivery are rare and often kind of targeted or selected in some way. But partly it's because reform doesn't happen in a vacuum. Anytime a politician may want to try and improve the quality of public services, there is essentially no politically costless way to do it. If you want to improve the quality of public services for everyone on average, it may involve kind of taking on powerful lobbies or vested interests. And so you may have a situation where there's diffuse benefits, but very concentrated costs. And specifically, there are those who perceive themselves as victims of the reform may oppose the policy very strongly. One example of I guess the example I'll be looking at is a school reform, and there's kind of good evidence from various parts of the world that teachers teachers are able to predict whether they will benefit from for example, a performance pay reform, as in this Christina Brown and Tahira Drabi's paper and Karthik and Venkatesh's paper earlier. And so we've seen lots of examples of where the opponents, civil servants often, who oppose some kind of reform can really stymie its implementation. And so voters then experience not only the intended reform, but also the unintended political blowback of the reform. And this may complicate both the way that politicians receive any electoral benefit from it, and also our attempts to measure the political benefits or costs to reform, if that makes sense. And so disentangling kind of these direct and indirect effects of a policy reform can be really tricky, and have very different policy implications. So what I'm going to do in this paper is leverage a randomized school reform from Liberia that was randomized in a very special way that'll allow me, I think, to kind of cast some light on disentangling these direct and indirect political effects of the reform. I'll talk more about it, but this paper has this program has already been evaluated by a previous paper of mine with Mauricio Romero and Justin Sandifer, and found to raise test scores and teacher attendance on average. And the program was carried out, the randomization was carried out within matched pairs. And so this is very important because it's going to give us variation in the size of the quality shock across kind of the spectrum of these matched pairs within which the randomization was done. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay. The outcomes that I'll look at are, measuring the impact of this exogenous, what else, I think can be considered some kind of exogenous shock to school quality on the incumbent party's vote share at various levels of government, the attitudes of the affected households, and also the political activities of the teachers in the affected schools. I also have a part that I actually won't get to in this talk because it's too short, but I measured voter information with a couple of survey experiments for both candidates and voters. Okay, so let me just give a couple slides of background on what this reform is. It's called Partnership Schools for Liberia. It was implemented by the Liberian Ministry of Education in 2016. It involved, treating 93 public primary schools, and this treatment essentially consisted in making these public schools into charter schools, or something very similar to what would be considered a charter school in the U.S. or an academy in the U.K. And so 8 different private school providers were brought in to take over management of these previously public schools. I guess they were still publicly owned schools, privately managed schools. It also came with extra funding, so $50 per student of extra funding, which is actually quite a sizable shock to student funding. And it was also a big thing. It affected close to 10% of public primary school children in Liberia. So even though it was a pilot program, it was very widespread. Here's a map of the treatment and control schools across Liberia on the left. And crucially for my paper, this program was independently evaluated, and a paper was written about its effects. So let me talk about those direct effects of the program on what we might consider school quality. This is from my previous paper with Mauricio and Justin. We found that the program on average raised test scores by a decent amount, 0.18 standard deviations, which is equivalent to about 2/3 of a year of schooling. And not only did it increase test scores, but it also increased teacher attendance by a large margin and teacher time on task by a kind of a similarly large margin. Although the previous slide showed you the averages, there was a lot of heterogeneity in these effects. So those average effects mask a lot of heterogeneity. As I mentioned, the randomization was carried out within matched pairs. So prior to the treatment, we matched all the schools in all the kind of eligible schools, schools that were eligible to be treated, on a number of pre-treatment characteristics like the distance from the main road, the size of the school, the kind of number of or I guess access to 2G internet and things like this. And so kind of we matched up the 200 schools in the experiment into pairs. And so each one of these matched pairs, then we randomized treatment within that pair. So each one of those pairs kind of provides an extremely small n valid experiment. And if you just compare the outcomes, this plot is outcomes of outcomes of test scores from the treatment and control school within each pair. We find that there's a lot of variation. In some pairs, the treatment school ended up much better. In some, it actually ended up much worse. Okay, just to kind of foreground my main results, I will show that among a household survey of parents of kids at these schools, the parents were much more satisfied with their kids' education in the treated schools, which led at least me to suspect that there would be positive electoral treatment effects as well. That said, there were also kind of causes for concern. And so even though on average the treatment effects were positive on test scores and other things, there were some kind of very high profile and important failures. In one very large school, a bunch of students got kicked out of school and had to switch schools because of kind of a way that because of the choices of the school operator, the private school operator in that school. And so because of this and other kind of, I guess, important failures of the policy, the main teachers union, the NTAL, the National Teachers Association of Liberia, came out very strongly opposed to this charter school-like program. Although, I guess in some circles in, the education policy world, it's fashionable to think about these teacher unions as being very cynical. And I guess it's possible to read that here too. It's not necessary. You don't have to believe anything cynical about these teachers unions. There really were these well-documented, meaningful failures that likely caused harm for some students. And so, there's, even if the average effects were positive on test scores, there's very reasonable concerns with equity. And so I want to be clear that I'm not here to adjudicate the validity of any of the complaints people had with the program, or do any kind of welfare calculations. The point is just that many people like the program a little, and a few people dislike the program a lot, and I want to study how that translated into electoral outcomes for the responsible party. So with that caveat, let me talk a bit more about the just the strategy that I'm going to use. The trick here, I mean, as an RCT, the empirical strategy is relatively straightforward. The only tricky thing is mapping the treatment geography onto the outcome geography. And so here I just define treatment at the level of the polling booth. And again, there's 2,000 total polling booths in the country. About 60% of them are within 10 kilometers of one of the schools in the RCT. And so I'm going to define treatment as the fraction of those RCT schools within 10 kilometers, which are treated. Okay.
Wayne,
yeah.
Just in case it's useful, I just wanted to give you a 5-minute warning.
Thanks, Julien. That's helpful. Okay. Here's the perfunctory balance table. Balance looks pretty good as expected. And with that, I'll move into the results. So my main result is that the polling booths near treated schools saw less of an electoral benefit for the politician, for the party that was responsible for this reform than the control schools. There was a negative electoral effect, and it's reasonably sizable. As you can see here, is on the order of 3 percentage points, where the kind of the base is about 30 percentage points. So this it's a non-trivial negative significant electoral effect. I want to just also highlight here that the first 2 columns here are vote share for the presidential candidate from the ruling party, and the second 2 are for legislative candidates. And I think it's interesting that in this context, the policy in question was promoted completely by the executive branch and had nothing to do really with the legislative branch, and that kind of jives with the results, where this seems to, or I guess this is at least suggestive of a level of sophistication among voters, where we only perceive electoral results at the level of government that really actually was responsible for the party. That said, it may be somewhat surprising, at least it surprised me, to find these negative electoral results for a policy which improves test scores on average. So one potential explanation is that these negative results could be driven by the opposition of important political players. As I mentioned before, the teachers union really very strongly and publicly opposed the reform. And if Liberia is a place where teachers are participating in machine politics, as they've been shown to do elsewhere, respected figures in the community who people look to, it's very possible that the opposition of teachers could turn voters in general against the government that created this reform. And so I want to show you some evidence on that. Teachers, the treatment effect of this policy on the affected teachers in the treated and controlled schools was negative on average. Across all teachers, there were negative coefficients on satisfaction with the incumbent president and intention to vote for the ruling party's presidential candidate. And for teachers who were members of the union, these were very strongly negative and significant. So this suggests that that teachers' views were negatively impacted. Teachers' views of the ruling party were negatively impacted by the policy, and not only their views, but also their activities. I ran a survey of teachers and asked them about their participation in various parts of the electoral process, and I found that teachers at treated schools were much less likely to staff registration booths and polling booths. They were much less likely to campaign for a party or candidate, and they were kind of less likely on an index of overall participation. So this kind of this seems to speak to kind of a withdrawing of a withdrawal from the political process of teachers. Now, just really briefly, I want to show that there's also another side to this. Like, how did voters themselves respond, and was it contingent on how well the policy worked? Again, I showed you that variation in policy effectiveness, and I'm going to interact a variable for the treatment effect on test scores with the treatment dummy, to see whether, in places on the right side of this graph, in places where the treatment had a relatively bigger effect on test scores, did it have a differential effect on electoral outcomes overall? And I'm going to find that the answer is yes. That in places where the treatment effect on test scores was greater than the median, there was a positive countervailing effect which wiped out the negative effect overall. And so, what I find, I think, again, this table presents these results in the same format that I showed the previous table, just to show that I'm looking at the same outcomes here. Vote share for the ruling party's presidential candidate and legislative candidates. Once again, we only find effects for the presidential candidate who actually was accountable for the policy. And I think that I like these results better in the form of a graph, where you can see that as the treatment effect on test scores on the x-axis goes up, so does the treatment effect on the incumbent party vote share. And so in places where the treatment effect on test scores was actually very, very high, the sign flips, and we do find positive electoral effects. So I know I'm just about out of time. I will skip all discussion of the information experiments that I ran. So what I found is that in Liberia, in this context of a school reform which had been shown by researchers to be successful on certain technocratic grounds, the school reform actually cost the responsible party votes on net. That's part of this seems to have something to do with the opposition of teachers who really felt like they were victims of the reform. But maybe the silver lining for people who are interested in voter accountability for service reform or service delivery is that in places where the policy worked really, really well, that there seems to have been a counteracting effect where voters rewarded the government for the policy. And so this highlights the political risks of trying to move to a strategy of public service provision in the face of opposition from maybe clientelistic or patronage elements. But it also shows maybe that there is some hope here, where if researchers can lower the cost to politicians to figuring out how to improve public service delivery, that has the potential to empower the politicians who want to choose to compete on those margins rather than on traditional vote buying or clientelist margins. So I'll conclude there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. It was like a very exciting paper and a pretty somewhat depressing finding, but still relevant. So why don't we move to Michael, and then we have the Q&A in about 15 minutes.
So yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. Really excited to be a part of this session. This is joint work with Kate Orkin at Oxford. We're both really looking forward to getting questions and feedback about this project. So a large focus in development economics has been in identifying aid programs that work for poverty alleviation. Cash transfer programs for social protection or poverty alleviation are widespread and have been implemented by both governments and non-governmental organizations. So a large body of literature has shown that cash transfers have benefit effects for direct recipients, and there's a growing set of results that are documenting positive effects for local economies as well. In this paper, we look at the implications of an NGO cash transfer program for civic and political engagement for both recipient and non-recipient households. Note that when we think about programs that are cash transfer programs or aid programs that are implemented by governments versus kind of not NGOs or other actors, the desired effects of the program in these domains may vary. So governments may want, and evidence has shown that in some, though not all cases, they do benefit electorally from implementing aid programs, whereas in many cases, NGO type programs may want to be independent. That said, even an independent program or a programmatic policy may still have effects on civic and political engagement in potentially positive and negative ways. So on one hand, there's concerns that aid programs may distort outcomes for local political systems. So economic conditions are a strong predictor of electoral outcomes. So programs that improve economic conditions, either for recipients themselves or for local economies as a whole, may wind up helping incumbents, even if the incumbents didn't have anything to do with the program. Households may also misattribute credit for programs to politicians that were not involved, or local leaders could claim credit for these programs, which may also benefit incumbents, and these could insulate incumbents and reduce accountability. On the other hand, rising incomes may increase households' independence from patron-client relationships, or increase citizens' demands for services and willingness to hold governments accountable. The latter point is the central tenet of modernization theory. So in general, in many contexts, poor households are less likely to participate in civics and in politics. This is a trend that we can document in our data as well. And so richer citizens may have more time or attention for civic and political engagement, or may place more emphasis on self-expression or programmatic policies over a more transactional relationship with politicians. So cash transfers could help reduce the cost barriers to participants by poor households. And in addition, the way in which candidates engage with their constituents may also change in response to programs like these, and that could either be beneficial or harmful. And as many cash transfer programs continue to scale, their interaction with local institutions only grows in importance. So in this paper, we study an NGO unconditional lump sum cash transfer program that was randomized across about 1,000 villages in Western Kenya. So we combined two separate RCTs that are focused primarily on economic effects. The first paper, the Egger et al. 2019, in which I'm part of the et al. Of that citation, was looking primarily at spillover effects. And Orkin et al. 2020 was looking at cash transfers cross-randomized with a goal-setting intervention. Both of these programs find positive effects on consumption, asset ownership, and future aspirations. And we make use of the randomized design to separately examine effects on civic and political engagement. This includes individual and community level interactions with local politicians and interactions and attendance at local meetings and support for different programs. And so by chance, the goal setting study cash transfers happened to go out in the period around the April 2017 primary elections in Kenya and in advance of the August 2017 election. The spillover study transfers were going out in 2014 to 2016, so also in advance of the 2017 election. So we really are focusing on the period in time kind of before and right after the 2017 election. Our data is based on survey measures with over 10,000 eligible and ineligible households from the goal setting trial, as well as surveys of local leaders across both trials. And so given time constraints for today's talk, I'm going to focus primarily on data from the goal setting trial at the household level. And given that I won't have time to go into all of this, I'll give a brief summary of our main findings. So first, we find very little evidence that local leaders are claiming credit for the program, and no evidence of households attributing credit to local politicians. This is both in terms of the low mean levels of credit claiming, as well as an absence of treatment effects. And so this accorded with our priors, as the NGO worked really hard to make it clear that they were independent of government and local leaders. And we think that this is interesting because it lets us study the effects of the income shock alone, rather than kind of combining this with some feelings that this is being implemented by the government. Second, we find no effects on choices or behaviors relating to the kind of local level elections, either in turnout, vote choice, or ratings of candidates. We find that recipient households are less likely to receive offers for their votes, and it seems like there's like a shifting in the patterns that households wind up engaging. So households are shifting out of these like lower level, kind of what we term as subsistence level exchanges worth small amounts of money into higher value group engagement. And then ineligible households wind up increasing these interactions to some extent. And then we find no real effects in terms of changes in participation processes to allocate public goods funding. So to briefly describe the context that we're working in, we're focusing on household interactions with local administrators, community groups, and local politicians. These are known as the members of the county assembly, and they're the lowest level elected leaders in Kenya. We focus on local level races, and at least in the area that we study, there's one dominant party at the national level, but there's considerably more competition in these local level races, especially both in the primary process. And so we think that this is an interesting there's a lot more variation, I guess, that we can take advantage of in terms of these races. So there's a number of kind of lower level exchanges that households can have with local politicians and aspirants. Small cash payments or gifts are often provided for attending rallies or for showing public support, such as wearing a t-shirt for a candidate. There is some vote buying, which we'll document. And local political aspirants also frequently receive requests for assistance from households for things such as medical bills or funeral expenses or school fees, though these are granted more infrequently. Community groups are very common in this area. And these can form an important role for both informal savings with kind of the Rasta merry-go-round type groups, and they also wind up serving as managing public goods. And together, these groups can make requests to local leaders to kind of have more strength in numbers as they go to the leaders to ask for services for their area. Villages in our study area do not receive a set budget from the government, so if they want to undertake projects, they must appeal to higher levels for development funds. So there are specific ward development funds, which are supposed to have regular meetings that households can attend, which provides another mean for local civic engagement by households. And in our data, we find that there does seem to be differences in participation between the poor eligible households and the richer ineligible households on a number of different dimensions. So in particular, poor households are more likely to be engaged in these more subsistence-related activities, such as making private requests, supporting candidates in public in exchange for small token payments, and they're less likely to be engaged in community groups and fundraisers. In particular, these are things that cost money in order to participate in. So the intervention that we study is an unconditional $1,000 NGO cash transfer made by the NGO Give Directly. These payments were made in 3 tranches, 2 months apart. They're offered to roughly the poorest 40% of villages on objective poverty measures, and they're made through the mobile money platform M-Pesa. Importantly, prior to transfers going out in a village, there's a community meeting is held explaining that the funds are coming from an American nonprofit with funding from business and private individuals, and they're not related to any politician or government. And we think that this is a really important point, highlighting that the way in which we're kind of not finding misattribution here. So as previously mentioned, we're kind of combining 2 different RCT trials. I'm going to focus on the goal setting again, because that's where most of the results are coming from for today's talk. So this was a 2x2 design where cash and goal setting interventions were kind of cross-cut. And the control group here receives a placebo kind of psychological goal setting intervention. So I'll refer to these as placebo villages. We have survey data from both eligible and ineligible households, which are from the primary female in these groups, as well as from local leaders. And this study covered 413 villages in CI and Homa Bay counties in Kenya. And so we're going to focus on the effects of being in a cash village in all of our results as we go forward. So to give a quick sense of the timeline, we present CDFs of the % of each different activities that we have going on. So these are this line here shows when the cash transfers were going out. This has started kind of during the period leading up to the primary election in April 2017. There's a large voter registration drive in January and February of 2017, although voters could continue registering up until May. And then we look at the August 2017 general election, when we have local leader data collection coming shortly after, and then follow-up surveys with households are about 19 months after the transfer start date. So we pool eligible and ineligible households in order to estimate a specification with indicators for being in a cash village, for being an eligible household, and the interaction between the two. We control for the goal setting intervention, as well as including ward fixed effects, the level of the elections that we study. And we use these estimates to make 3 main comparisons. We look at the effects for eligible households in cash villages versus eligible households in placebo villages, these 2 terms here. We look at ineligible households in cash villages versus ineligible households in placebo villages. And then lastly, we look at eligible households in cash villages versus eligible households in ineligible households in cash villages to understand whether or not their behaviors are differing from there. We can make the same comparison as for 3 in placebo villages, also to kind of understand how do these types of households differ in the absence of any of these treatment effects, and that kind of comes with the participation gradients that we were documenting before. So turning to the results, so we don't see any changes in our pre-specified summary of voting participation, nor in turnout, nor for eligible or ineligible households within these. So to quickly walk through the table, the first row is like the first effect that we discussed before for eligible households and cash versus placebo, the second for ineligible and cash versus placebo, and then the third comparing the two of them. And so kind of across the board, we aren't seeing much in terms of effects on this side. We're seeing very high turnout rates, and this is self-reported data, about 93%. But we note that, in the administrative data that we have as well, like turnout is quite high. So over about 85% of households wind up reporting turning out in the administrative data, we see about 85% turnout in these areas. I won't have time to get into this, but we also can show that voters correctly don't identify the local leaders, as mentioned, and political efficacy and knowledge about candidates and politics don't really change either. So we find some interesting results. While we don't see really much going on in the electoral outcomes, we do find interesting patterns around vote buying. So recipient households report receiving fewer offers for their votes, and they're less likely to have accepted an offer for their vote, which leads to declines in the value of accepted offers and the fact that they're less likely to vote for the party making an offer. In contrast, we find that ineligible households are somewhat more likely to engage in both of these activities. So it does seem that there's a bit of a shift going on. And whereas like you might have thought that, if we focus only on the eligible households, we see these great trends without the kind of countervailing force that suggests that maybe that there's some reallocation kind of going on across households within these areas. And then this table here shows what we're kind of the evidence that we're thinking about the way in which households are shifting out of these kind of lower value subsistence activities into higher value group functions. And so we see that the eligible households are making fewer requests for private support, they're attending fewer candidate events, and they're also supporting candidates in public less frequently, while they're more likely to be involved in groups, and the value of their contributions to these fundraisers are going up, and the value of the group initiatives that they're involved in are higher. We see a little bit of an evidence that, for ineligible households, at least on some of these subsistence type activities, we're seeing increases there. And so lastly, we were looking at kind of public goods participation, and we don't really see any effects on both the involvement in these consultation processes or in the public goods projects that are started within the kind of the first 4 years that are going on here. So this is consistent with some of my other work in the GE study areas that are kind of not finding effects on these dimensions. So to kind of quickly conclude, so we're looking at the civic and political effects of an NGO cash transfer program using RCTs and collecting data from both eligible and ineligible households. We think this is kind of a unique opportunity to provide more experimental evidence on these questions. We're finding that the program isn't changing outcomes of the local political systems, since are correctly attributing credit and they don't change voting or approval ratings of incumbents or the dominant party candidates. We think this is important. It is possible, I guess, as a proof of concept, this is context dependent, but it is possible to kind of design systems like these and information campaigns around these to kind of not have these types of effects. And then we do it seems like that the cash recipients are kind of reducing some of their small private exchanges while kind of being more involved in group activities. So we think this suggests that, the cost of engagement may be one limiting factor for poor households in getting involved in civics and politics. Though a caveat to these results is, everything that we've looked at so far is on short run effects. And we have ongoing work that's collecting more longer run data. So we'll be able to kind of see some of these systems and these local institutions may take more time before they're able to change. Thank you.
Right, thanks a lot, Michael. So I think Kate Orkin has a question in the Q&A that she wants to ask to Wayne.
So Wayne, I was wondering if it's great paper, great first paper and very exciting to see the second one. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the channels, like how do you think the teacher unions' feelings about this reform have filtered down to the general public? Because it seemed like there would be relatively few teacher union members and I wasn't sure the general public would care. So I was just interested to hear a bit more from you about that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And it's a great question. I went through this kind of fast, and I don't think I said it very clearly. I had the same question, which is part of why I ran the survey of not only teachers' attitudes, but also teachers' political activities. And so, the fact that I find that teachers are less likely to be staffing registration booths and polling booths, and teachers are less likely to be campaigning for any candidates, to me is, it's not really a smoking gun in terms of like a kind of patronage situation going on, but I think it's consistent with the idea that, you know, in the absence of, I guess prior to this rupture, prior to like this reform that alienated the teachers, you know, that teachers may have been, you know, exerting their influence to try and kind of get out the vote on behalf of the ruling party. And when they stopped doing that, that kind of that showed up in the aggregate admin data on the voting level too. That's my conjecture, but again, I think my evidence is kind of suggestive on that.
Thanks. Why don't I ask another question to Manuel? I was interested in, you know, so it's pretty cool. So you have those measures of like preferences before the meeting, and then you have the meeting, and then you check whether the ex-ante preferences are kind of represented in the decision, if I understand correctly. And I was wondering whether you think there's also scope for the rate at which preferences change is also affected by the type of stuff. Maybe men and women are going to change their preferences differently when they go to a meeting, because maybe also part of this participatory process is kind of people realizing that, you know, they might not have thought as much as they thought about a given issue, and then through the discussion, maybe changing their own preferences. And so have you made any attempt to try to measure that in your surveys as well, and whether you see any differential change?
Thank you very much for the question. So far, we haven't done that. We do have information on preferences before meeting and preferences after meeting,
Okay.
but I'm gathering that your type of measurement would require a slightly finer grained, like multi-wave.
Potentially, yeah.
Preferences, yeah. So far we haven't done that, but we could try to actually implement it in a future wave that we're trying to schedule in the next few months to see if their preferences have changed over time, and of course compare the two different types of groups with each other.
I was wondering, so there's obviously kind of all the theories of kind of client poverty and links to clientelism, but there's also a lot of theories now, like there's some work in Brazil on like kind of vulnerability and clientelism. And I was wondering if you have any data on kind of shocks facing those households, and maybe if there's a role to kind of trying to better project your theories about kind of there's no direct effect on clientelism by looking at kind of people who are faced by a negative shock. Do you still find this kind of very limited effect on the clientelism dimension?
Yeah, thanks, Julien. So I think there's a lot more that we're trying to do around heterogeneity and effects, both kind of related to those points, but also more broadly. So I think that, you know, we have data on kind of households situations, both before and after, and so we can think about that. And I think it's also interesting to sort of think about, again, you know, if you are kind of conditioning on eligible versus ineligible households that have very similar kind of like asset levels and things like that, like how do you wind up like having things look? So you could think that, you know, there's some people that, and I think also kind of in some ways like benchmarking, like, okay, so now these households are a little bit richer. Are they behaving in the same way as the households that they are kind of like at the wealth level of now versus other versus kind of where they were before? So I think that there's a lot more that we can kind of do in those dimensions, and that's kind of on our agenda for the next round of presentations.
Thanks. We have a question in the Q&A from Jean-Pierre Tranchant. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julien. Yes, I just had a question on the last table, I think, where you showed that people seem to dislike the policy in terms of being less likely to vote for the president party. But this seems to be flipped in places where the policy was very successful. I think that's a very cool result. I was just wondering if there is a possibility that it is reverse causality. So in places where the president's party is a bit stronger, then the policy was also more likely to be successful, and therefore we observe this correlation. So I just wanted to see if that's a possibility or not.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's a fantastic question. And this is, you know, randomization helps us to get past this, but, well, yeah, I should, the variation I think that you're talking about, the variation in policy effectiveness was not random, you know, was not random, and I need to be upfront about that. for whatever it's worth, in the balance table that I breezed past in the the previous the pre-treatment election, which was in 2011, interacting that dummy for the treatment effectiveness of the subsequent policy with treatment shows no effects on any of the outcomes that I'm looking at on the president's popularity or vote share. So like I think there's pretty good evidence that that is not reverse causality, but I think that's the best I can do to respond to that question. Yeah, so I mean, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Can I follow up with a related question, I think, for Wayne?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I really like the way that you're kind of like looking and seeing the kind of the treatment effects for by quality here. But I think my understanding was that there was also some kind of particular schools or particular providers that people had more animosity, I guess, towards. And I was wondering whether or not like you're seeing kind of like any particular, like if you're able to kind of look at all at like, okay, here's on the negative side, these are the places that like the teachers union was particularly up in arms about, were their effects kind of different than everyone else, or was it just kind of that the teachers union was broadly against this policy and kind of like acting a little bit more uniform across the board?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I haven't run the specific analysis that you suggest, even though I want to. As far as like heterogeneity among providers, there's just, because there's only 8 different providers, there's just not, there's not really power to kind of distinguish among them. But in terms of kind of pooling it at the larger level of just saying, is there correlation between, test scores and, teacher union opposition, or I guess test score treatment effects and teacher union opposition. That's a super interesting thing that I will do now. Thanks for that idea.
Right. So I have a question for Wayne from Jason in the Q&A. Maybe read it, which is, one silver lining in the paper seems to be that parents have greater information and education, which is counter to a lot of the education literature. Is this a result of a particular visible policy, or do parents know more than what we give them credit for?
Yeah, Jason, that's a great question. I also was really actually surprised by how, I guess by that correlation, by like how much parents, or I guess voters, I should say, seem to know about the treatment effects on test scores. One thing that I'm incorporating into the paper now is exactly what you suggest, is looking at kind of treatment effects on more visible things. So like I find a similar correlation where there's stronger positive political effects in places where there is also more treatment effects on construction and construction of new classrooms, and building new schools, or building new classrooms, I should say. So like those are kind of like some of the visible things that we had data on that I think fall into the category that you're considering. That said, when I include both these things in the regression, both the treatment effects on classroom construction and the treatment effects on test scores, the coefficients are positive and significantly and statistically significant on both of them. So it seems to be that there's some independent effect of test scores, or at least some other thing that's correlated with test scores that's independent of kind of the more visible things of school construction. Yeah.
Thanks. I was sent a question from Manuel. Let me read it. What kind of implications do your results have? What kind of implication do your results about the throughput have for all the RCTs that use training? And how does that relate to the literature on the identity of the training providers?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. By training, do you mean things like job training, or I'm not sure whether the question specified that.
The question does not specify that, but you can make the assumption if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So it's an interesting question, and I think it definitely highlights the possibility for some of these processes to be slightly steered and slightly corrupted, depending on who the identity of the discussion leaders are. Typically, as my understanding is that a lot of these processes that are on the ground are essentially carried out in a sort of a convenient sample way, selecting the local politician or the local bureaucrat that is most available to do this. But I think the primary implications of our results from that perspective is that you can clearly see a small tendency for meeting outcomes to be guided by whether the bureaucrat is the person leading discussion is neutral or not. Having said that, we're not yet able to determine whether this is because participants themselves on the spot are changing their preferences to what the discussion leader wants to hear. Obviously, on the ground, they know that this is a person coming from the institution or not. Before attending the meeting, they did not know, and the identity was completely randomized by us. But on the ground, they do know, and they might be slightly tweaking their preferences to meet that of what they think the institution has. So there's, it might be a negative effect, but there also are a few caveats here.
Yeah, I guess that's really interesting. It's also like potentially why some of those kind of findings on those participatory processes are so hard to replicate across context, because it's just kind of very small differences in who runs the meetings and who those things can affect.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. That's really useful. Let me ask another question to Michael then. So I quite like the regressions where you show you basically like people are less likely to be targeted for vote buying, they're kind of less likely to accept, and they're less likely to vote for the people who end up kind of paying them. How do you deal with kind of the changes in sample composition across those regressions? Because I'm guessing once you start going to the second and third outcomes, and the sample might no longer be comparable in a sense between your treatment and a control group. I was just wondering how you dealt with that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in what we're showing there, these are still just kind of all unconditional results. So this is kind of on average, we're still kind of seeing these declines. But I agree that on an interpretation side, it's still important to kind of to take a careful look at like what's going on there. And so we are finding that, you know, in most cases, if an offer is made, the offer is typically accepted. Or so I guess I should say, if a household reports an offer being made, the household also almost always reports that the offer is being accepted. So I think that it's really the kind of the beginning stage of that, like the fact that they're getting fewer offers is then kind of like what winds up kind of percolating through for the later columns.
Great. And there's actually a question from Ondino in the chat for you, Michael, as well, which is, what is the role of economic empowerment in determining the voting patterns in your research?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the, you know, at some level, the fact that we're kind of looking, we're trying to sort of see, like, you could think of the cash transfer intervention as in kind of increasing economic empowerment. And so that, you know, like that's the fact that we're not finding that we're really kind of changing a lot of like the voting pattern on that side suggests that that maybe we're not seeing as much in that area. That said, it does seem that like in some of these other civic type of activities, the fact that, you know, you have more money and potentially more time allows you to kind of join community groups. So a lot of these community groups frequently have a rotating savings and credit association component to them, even if they're also involved in other types of civic and political engagement. So you can kind of, sometimes people have to, you know, you have to have money in order to be able to make those payments or to be involved in like the group in that way. And so the fact that you have greater economic means allows you to kind of participate in some of these other types of activities in a way that you couldn't have before.
Michael, can I just ask a really quick follow-up to that, which is, I know the timeline is not great for this, but did you guys happen to ask about political entry? Like, are there more people, when people get richer, are they more likely to express interest in becoming politicians themselves?
Yeah, so my sense is that these folks are still well below the resource thresholds that you need in order to like really engage in a lot of these political activities. So like the level of requests that people wind up making from politicians is like quite high, and they wind up having to kind of just, you know, meet those types of requests. But we have information about, we had surveyed a lot of the local aspirants, and so we have some information about that. I don't think we've ever checked to see like whether or not any of them were recipients, but my sense is that it's still, these households are still kind of like noticeably below the kind of economic levels that typical candidates usually are.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool, thanks.
All right, great. So thanks everyone. It was a very exciting set of papers. I'm glad we had some very nice presentation. So we'll stop now. I'm sure the panelists are going to stick around for a little while longer if you need more if you want to ask more questions directly. Otherwise, we will be back in about 30 minutes for questions on institutions and norms. So by all means, go take a walk, get a bit of fresh air, but it's time to be back in 30 minutes for another great set of papers. So thanks a lot and see you soon.